In the summer skies over England, 1944, a new and terrifying sound cut through the air. It wasn't the thunder of bombers nor the whistle of falling bombs. It was something else, mechanical, eerie, and relentless. Londoners would look up and see a small, winged shape streaking across the sky, a fiery exhaust trailing behind it. They called it the buzz bomb. To the Germans, it was the V-1 flying bomb, the world's first cruise missile. To the British, it was the latest chapter in their fight for survival. Every time the engine of a V-1 sputtered and died, silence would follow. And that silence was the most terrifying sound of all, because it meant the bomb was plunging toward its target. Entire neighborhoods shook under their blasts. Streets were turned to rubble in seconds. Families huddled in fear, unsure if the next weapon would fall on them. Winston Churchill himself described these new attacks as one of the most grave threats Britain had ever faced. By June 1944, as the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy, Hitler's desperate gamble to strike back at Britain was already in motion. From hidden launch sites in occupied France, Germany unleashed thousands of these pilotless bombs, hoping to break British morale and stall the Allied advance. Each V-1 carried nearly a ton of explosives. Alone, it wasn't as destructive as a bomber raid, but the sheer number of them, the relentless barrages, turned the weapon into a nightmare. At first, British defenses scrambled to adapt. Anti-aircraft guns fired wildly into the skies, often missing the fast-moving drones. Fighter pilots chased them down, sometimes trying to shoot them, sometimes even nudging them off course with their wings, an act as daring as it was dangerous. Yet despite all this bravery, too many V-1s were getting through. Too many bombs were striking London, Kent, Sussex, and beyond. The British people, already weary from years of war, faced a new storm of destruction. And yet, in the shadows of secrecy, a scientific breakthrough was about to change everything. A weapon so advanced, so far ahead of its time, that even German scientists, renowned for their rocketry and engineering, could scarcely imagine it. A device hidden inside the shells of Allied anti-aircraft guns, invisible to the naked eye, but powerful enough to transform the entire battle. A tiny mechanism known as the proximity fuse, or as American soldiers called it, the VT fuse. It was a marvel of miniaturization, born out of a race against time. Developed in the United States by some of the era's greatest scientific minds, it worked on a simple but ingenious principle. Instead of relying on a shell striking a target directly, an almost impossible feat against a small, fast-moving missile, the fuse could detect when it was close enough to an object in flight. The shell didn't need to hit the V-1 dead on. It only needed to get near. Once it sensed proximity, the fuse detonated the explosive, unleashing a deadly cloud of shrapnel. Suddenly, near misses became lethal hits. This was the secret weapon the Germans never knew existed. To them, it seemed almost like magic. How could Allied gunners, once so inaccurate, suddenly bring down so many of their V-1s? The answer was hidden in the unseen waves of radio signals inside each fuse, signals bouncing off nearby objects, telling the device when to explode. It was radar, not in a massive ground station, but shrunk down into something the size of a light bulb, fitted into every shell. The invention of the proximity fuse was itself a saga of determination. In 1940, as German bombers darkened British skies during the Blitz, the urgency for better defenses grew. American and British scientists joined forces, sharing ideas and technology at a pace rarely seen before. In laboratories from Massachusetts to Maryland, from Bell Labs to the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, engineers tinkered, tested, and risked their lives with volatile experiments. Many doubted it could be done. Miniaturizing radar components, making them rugged enough to withstand the extreme acceleration of being fired from a gun, seemed nearly impossible. But piece by piece, they solved the puzzle. By late 1942, prototypes were being tested in secret. By 1943, the first battlefield deployments proved astonishingly effective against Japanese planes in the Pacific. And by 1944, when the V-1 threat began to rain down on England, the stage was set for the VT fuse to demonstrate its true power. The secrecy around the fuse was absolute. Soldiers were warned never to let unexploded shells fall into enemy hands. Even the name, VT fuze, was deliberately misleading, standing for variable time, a code meant to conceal its true nature. To the outside world, it sounded like a small improvement in timing mechanisms. In reality, it was one of the greatest leaps in weapons technology of the 20th century. The British knew they needed every possible advantage. London was burning, its people exhausted. Anti-aircraft crews lined the southern coast, scanning the skies for the next wave of flying bombs. Their guns were powerful, their training disciplined, but without accuracy, their efforts were wasted. The introduction of the VT fuze would change that balance almost overnight, but the Germans didn't know. In their reports, they struggled to explain why so many of their precious V-1s were being destroyed. They blamed better Allied radar, faster planes, or even luck. They never guessed that inside each shell bursting near their weapons was a technological miracle they had completely overlooked. For a nation that prided itself on scientific innovation, it was a blind spot that cost them dearly. And then came that single day in 1944, a day when the skies over southern England turned into a shooting gallery. A day when Allied gunners, equipped with VT fuses, achieved results so stunning they seemed impossible. In just 24 hours, they brought down 82% of all the V-1s launched at them. The statistics were staggering, the implications profound. Britain had gone from defense to dominance in a matter of hours. This was more than just a tactical victory. It was a moment that showed the true marriage of science and war, the way innovation could tip the scales of history. The Germans never knew what had hit them. They never understood why their flying bombs, once so feared, had suddenly become little more than clay pigeons for Allied gunners. But behind this triumph lay deeper stories, of scientists working in secret laboratories, of soldiers on the front lines trusting a technology they barely understood, of commanders gambling on something unproven but desperate for results, and of civilians standing in the streets of London who would never know how close they had come to losing their city. The V-1 campaign would not last forever. Newer, deadlier weapons were already being prepared by Germany. But in that crucial summer, the proximity fuse had given Britain breathing room. It had saved lives. And it had proven that sometimes the smallest devices can make the biggest difference. The question remains, how did it all unfold? How exactly did these tiny fuses turn the tide against Hitler's flying bombs? What did it look like? On the ground, when gunners first realized their shells were working in ways they had never seen before? And why, to this day, is the story of the VT fuze often overshadowed by other wartime technologies? To answer that, we must dive deeper into the battles, the science, and the secrecy that defined this hidden weapon of World War II. In the early days of the V-1 campaign, the British countryside echoed with the thunder of anti-aircraft guns. Crews manned their batteries along the southern coast, eyes fixed on the horizon. The flying bombs came fast, at speeds close to 400 miles per hour, their distinctive buzzing engines making them hard to mistake. Gunners tracked them, aimed, and fired, but hit rates remained frustratingly low. The shells often exploded harmlessly in the air, far from their targets, while the drones streaked onward toward London. For the soldiers on the ground, it was a test of endurance. Each failed interception meant another explosion in the capital. The public, weary from years of the Blitz, questioned whether their government could truly stop this new menace. But then, without warning, something began to change. In July of 1944, new shipments of shells quietly arrived at the gun sites. They looked ordinary. Nothing in their design suggested the revolution hidden inside. Even the crews who fired them often didn't know the details. They were told only that these were special shells, experimental, and that strict secrecy surrounded them. To the men loading the guns, it was just another box of ammunition. But when they fired, the results spoke for themselves. The first signs were subtle. Instead of the usual near misses, gunners began to notice explosions occurring closer to their targets. Then, V-1s that might once have slipped through were suddenly erupting mid-air, their debris raining harmlessly into fields and countryside. The success rates jumped sharply. Within days, the skies over Kent and Sussex were filled with fiery blossoms of intercepted bombs. Reports flowed up the chain of command. Kill ratios, once dismal, now surged. By mid-July, anti-aircraft defenses armed with the VT fuze were destroying more than half of all incoming V-1s. And on one extraordinary day, the miracle reached its peak. In just 24 hours, Allied gunners shot down 82% of the missiles launched toward them. It was an unprecedented victory, one that stunned even the most optimistic commanders. Imagine the scene. Dozens of launch sites in northern France ignite in the early hours of the morning. Wave after wave of V-1s roar into the skies, set on trajectories toward London. The usual expectation. Some will be stopped, but too many will get through. Yet this time, as they cross the English Channel and approach the southern coast, they meet a wall of fire unlike anything before. Radar stations track them, gunners lock on, and shells burst not randomly, but with deadly precision. Bomb after bomb shatters midair long before reaching their targets. For Londoners, the difference was immediate. Fewer explosions rocked their neighborhoods. Fear began to give way to relief. Though the V-1 campaign continued, its impact had been blunted. The city was scarred, yes, but it was no longer on the brink of collapse. Behind this miracle was a blend of science and strategy. The proximity fuse worked by sending out tiny radio signals. When those signals bounced back from a nearby object, the fuse calculated the distance and detonated at the perfect moment. The concept may sound simple today, but in the 1940s it was a marvel. Miniaturizing the electronics into a rugged, reliable package had required years of research. Every component had to survive the incredible stresses of being fired from a gun. Accelerations thousands of times the force of gravity, followed by sudden pressure changes and vibrations in flight. A lesser device would have shattered instantly, yet these fuses endured. They turned every shell into something far more lethal than before. Instead of relying on a direct hit, akin to threading a needle at supersonic speeds, gunners only needed to fire within a lethal radius. The fuse did the rest. This single leap in technology transformed anti-aircraft fire from a desperate gamble into a calculated science. The statistics tell the story. Before the VT fuse, hitting a flying bomb was a rare feat. With it, interception rates soared. Some batteries reported that their kill percentages quadrupled. The effect was so dramatic that one British officer reportedly described it as the greatest single improvement in anti-aircraft defense since the gun itself. And yet, the Germans remained oblivious. Their intelligence networks combed through reports, trying to explain the sudden shift. They suspected improved radar guidance, better gunnery training, or new types of explosive charges. They never guessed that the secret lay inside the shells themselves. Even if a dud had landed, the chances of them discovering the fuse's true purpose were slim, because Allied forces took extreme measures to prevent capture. Any shell that failed to detonate was considered a security emergency. Patrols would rush to recover it before enemy spies could. Crews were even instructed to risk their lives destroying or concealing unexploded rounds rather than let them fall into German hands. The stakes were that high. Because the proximity fuse wasn't just effective against V-1s, its applications spanned every theater of the war. In the Pacific, American naval gunners armed with VT fuses had already devastated Japanese aircraft, especially kamikaze attacks. On land, artillery shells equipped with these fuses created devastating airbursts over enemy troops, showering them with shrapnel from above. But in Europe, against the V-1s, the technology found perhaps its most dramatic showcase. The irony is striking. Germany, the birthplace of so many technological wonders during the war, the jet fighter, the ballistic missile, advanced submarines, was undone in part by something it hadn't even considered developing. They had poured immense resources into the V-weapons program, hoping these new tools would change the course of the conflict. But in their calculations, they never accounted for the possibility that Allied guns might suddenly become nearly infallible. For the gunners themselves, the change was almost surreal. Veterans who had spent months firing round after round with little to show for it now watched their shells detonate with uncanny accuracy. The air was filled with the wreckage of destroyed V-1s. One gunner later recalled, "It was like shooting birds out of the sky. Only these birds were full of high explosives. There was also a psychological element. The V-1s had been designed not just as weapons, but as instruments of terror. The buzzing drone, the sudden silence before impact, it was all meant to instill fear. But when Allied gunners began blasting them out of the sky in record numbers, the psychological tide shifted. Londoners still heard the buzz bombs, but more often than not, they also heard the reassuring thunder of anti-aircraft fire, followed by explosions high above, far from their homes. The terror gave way little by little to confidence. Meanwhile, in Berlin, German leaders received conflicting reports. Some officers insisted the V-1s were still striking effectively. Others warned that losses were too high, that something had fundamentally changed. But Hitler remained fixated on his vengeance weapons, convinced they would demoralize Britain and force the Allies to the negotiating table. He never knew that a tiny electronic brain hidden in Allied shells was dismantling his strategy before it even reached its targets. The story of the VT fuse is also one of secrecy and collaboration. Scientists, soldiers, and governments worked together across oceans, bound by a common purpose. The United States provided the technology, Britain provided the battlefield, and together they kept the secret locked tight. So valuable was the fuse that even Allied troops in Europe were initially forbidden to use it in ground combat, lest unexploded shells reveal its secrets. It wasn't until the Battle of the Bulge, when American forces faced overwhelming German assaults, that commanders finally allowed it to be unleashed against enemy troops. The results were devastating for the Germans. But during the summer of 1944, against the V-1s, the fuse's power was undeniable. It turned a desperate defense into a confident countermeasure. It gave London back its sky, and it left the Germans scrambling to understand why their wonder weapon was failing so spectacularly. As the weeks passed, interception rates remained high. The German launch sites, under constant bombardment from Allied bombers, grew less effective. Eventually, as the Allies advanced deeper into France, the threat of the V-1s diminished. But by then, the damage to German hopes was done. Their secret weapon had been blunted not by brute force, but by a hidden marvel of science. The proximity fuse had proven itself. But its true story, its impact on the war, and its place in the larger struggle between innovation and destruction was still unfolding. By late 1944, the V-1 campaign was faltering. Launch sites in northern France were overrun by Allied troops. Those that remained in Belgium and the Netherlands faced constant air raids, crippling their effectiveness. Yet still the flying bombs came, hundreds at a time, desperate attempts to strike back at Britain. But by now the outcome was all but certain. Each time a V-1 roared across the channel, it entered a killing zone defended by guns armed with the proximity fuse. Each time, it faced not chance, but near certainty of destruction. The day when Allied gunners destroyed 82% of the incoming missiles was not a fluke. It was the culmination of months of hidden work, secret research, and careful preparation. It showed that Britain was no longer at the mercy of Hitler's vengeance weapons. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. For a nation that had endured years of aerial bombardment, from the Blitz to the later rocket attacks, this victory was a turning point. The skies were no longer symbols of helpless terror. They became symbols of resilience, of defiance, and of the quiet genius of scientists who had armed the defenders with invisible power. The Germans, of course, had no idea. To them, it must have seemed as though fate itself had turned against their weapons. They did not know that inside each bursting shell was a miracle of technology. They did not understand that American laboratories thousands of miles away had crafted something so small yet so transformative. In their arrogance, they had assumed their own innovations would go unchallenged. They had created weapons meant to terrify, but in the end, they were the ones outmatched by invisible waves of radio energy. Yet the story of the VT fuse did not end with the V-1. It was, in many ways, just the beginning. On the battlefields of Europe, the weapon found new and devastating applications. During the Battle of the Bulge, as German forces launched their desperate counteroffensive in the frozen forests of Belgium, American commanders finally authorized the use of proximity fuses in field artillery. The results were catastrophic for the attackers. Instead of shells burying themselves harmlessly in snow or exploding on impact, they now detonated in the air above advancing troops, raining shrapnel in all directions. Entire units were shredded in minutes. German soldiers later described the bombardments as unlike anything they had ever faced, devastation descending from the sky, precise and merciless. In the Pacific, the story was just as dramatic. The U.S. Navy, locked in desperate battles against Japanese kamikazes, found in the VT fuze a savior. Suicide pilots who might once have struck their ships now exploded in fiery bursts hundreds of yards away. The statistics were staggering. Naval gunners reported success rates far beyond anything they had imagined possible. Some historians later argued that without the VT fuze, the Pacific War might have dragged on far longer, costing thousands more lives. But nowhere was the fuze's impact as sudden and visible as against the V-1s. In those summer skies over Britain, its power was on full display. The German strategy had relied on overwhelming defenses with sheer numbers. The proximity fuze stripped them of that advantage. Every wave of missiles was cut down with ruthless efficiency. Every attempt to terrorize London ended instead with fiery wreckage falling harmlessly into the countryside. The weapon designed to break morale had, instead, hardened it. The secrecy surrounding the fuze was so tight that its true story only emerged long after the war. For years, many people never knew why the V-1s had suddenly become so much less effective. Some credited the bravery of fighter pilots. Others praised radar or better training. Few suspected that the real answer lay in a device no bigger than a man's fist, hidden inside each shell. Even the soldiers who used it often had only the vaguest idea of how it worked. To them, it was enough to see results. More explosions in the sky, fewer on the ground. When the war ended, Allied leaders praised the proximity fuze as one of the greatest technological achievements of the conflict. Winston Churchill himself declared that it had been decisive, calling it second only to the atomic bomb in its importance to victory. General Dwight Eisenhower, reflecting years later, agreed. He listed the proximity fuze alongside radar and the atom bomb as one of the three inventions that had ensured Allied success, and yet it remained something of a forgotten marvel. Overshadowed by the glamour of jet aircraft, rockets, and nuclear weapons, the fuze was rarely celebrated in public memory, perhaps because it was hidden, invisible, and secret. Perhaps because it lacked the drama of a rocket launch or the terror of a mushroom cloud. But in its own quiet way, it had reshaped the battlefield as surely as any other invention of the war. For Germany, the consequences were profound. The V-1 had been intended as a weapon of vengeance, a symbol of technological might. But it was blunted almost immediately, its promise broken by Allied science. The Germans never knew why. They never realized that each time a buzz bomb fell from the sky in flames, it was not luck or fate, it was the hand of science, invisible yet unstoppable. This story is a reminder of how wars are fought not only with armies and strategies, but with ideas. In the laboratories of America and Britain, men and women worked tirelessly, far from the front lines, yet their contributions changed the course of battles thousands of miles away. The proximity fuze was the embodiment of that truth. It was proof that ingenuity and persistence could create weapons that shifted the balance of power. It is also a story of silence. The civilians of London who looked up and saw fewer bombs falling never knew the reason. They did not know that their safety rested on a tiny device hidden in shells. They thanked the gunners, the pilots, and the soldiers, and rightly so, but the invisible ally inside each round remained unknown. It was the secret war within the war, a story of triumph guarded until long after the guns fell silent. Today, when historians look back on the Second World War, the proximity fuze often appears in footnotes rather than headlines. But its legacy is profound. It marked the beginning of a new era of precision in warfare, an era where electronics and intelligence mattered as much as brute force. Without it, the V-1 campaign might have inflicted far greater damage. Without it, the Pacific War might have dragged on, with kamikazes striking ship after ship. Without it, the final battles in Europe might have cost many more lives. And so we return to that single day in 1944, the day when Allied guns destroyed 82% of the V-1s sent against them. A statistic, yes, but also a symbol. A symbol of what can happen when human fear meets human genius. A symbol of how science, when driven by necessity, can become the sharpest weapon of all. The Germans never knew. They never understood why their vengeance weapon had failed. They never discovered the secret hidden in those shells. And perhaps that is the final irony. They had gambled on terror, on the psychology of fear. But their enemies had gambled on knowledge, on science. And in the end, it was knowledge that triumphed. As the last V-1s fell, as Allied troops advanced across Europe, and as the war entered its final chapters, the proximity fuse remained one of the Allies' quiet victories. Not seen, not celebrated, but decisive all the same. A tiny spark of radio energy hidden in steel that brought down a storm of flying bombs and helped change the course of history.